When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, the world stood face to face with a horror so profound that it defied comprehension. The Nazi regime had orchestrated murder on an industrial scale, transforming the machinery of a modern state into an apparatus of death. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, they discovered the camps, the mass graves, the documentation of systematic extermination. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more Romani people, Slavs, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and others deemed unworthy of life by Nazi ideology. The question that haunted the Allied leaders was simple yet unprecedented. What do you do with the architects of genocide? How do you bring justice for crimes so massive that the existing legal framework had no name for them? The word genocide itself had to be invented to describe what had happened. And so began one of history's greatest reckonings, a pursuit of justice that would span decades and continents, hunting down those who believed they could escape accountability for the greatest crime in human history. The men we are about to examine were not monsters in the Hollywood sense. They were bureaucrats, soldiers, doctors, and administrators who went home to their families at night after spending their days organizing mass murder. They listened to classical music, loved their children, and believed themselves to be serving a higher purpose. This ordinariness, this banality of evil as it would later be called, made their crimes all the more chilling. These were educated men from civilized society who chose to participate in mechanized slaughter. Some showed remorse when finally cornered. Others went to their deaths insisting they were simply following orders, as if that could somehow absolve them of responsibility for actions that resulted in mountains of corpses. Their fates varied wildly. Some faced the hangman's noose. Others lived out comfortable lives in South America or the Middle East, protected by governments that valued their expertise more than they cared about justice. A few took their own lives rather than face judgment. Understanding what happened to these men after the war is not just about satisfying a desire for revenge. It is about understanding how justice works, or fails to work, in the aftermath of unthinkable evil. Heinrich Himmler stood at the very apex of the Nazi killing machine. As Reichsführer of the SS, and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, Himmler commanded the entire apparatus of terror that made the Holocaust possible. He controlled the Gestapo, the concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppen death squads, and the Waffen-SS. Every order for mass execution ultimately flowed through his office. Every camp, every gas chamber, every mobile killing unit operated under his authority. Himmler was not a thug or a street brawler like some early Nazis. He was a former chicken farmer who kept meticulous records and approached genocide with the mindset of a mid-level bureaucrat. He believed in efficiency, in documentation, in proper procedures for mass murder. When the Einsatzgruppen began shooting Jews by the hundreds of thousands on the Eastern Front, Himmler worried about the psychological toll on his men, not about the victims. His solution was to develop more efficient killing methods, which led directly to the gas chambers of the extermination camps. He personally attended executions to Steel himself, once nearly fainting at a mass shooting, then ordering his subordinates to find cleaner ways to kill that would not disturb the executioners. The scale of Himmler's responsibility cannot be overstated. He did not just sign papers and issue directives from a distance. He involved himself in the details, visiting concentration camps, reviewing construction plans for gas chambers, reading reports about kill rates and efficiency improvements. When the camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau was expanded, Himmler personally inspected the facilities. When questions arose about what to do with the bodies, about how to speed up the killing process, about whether children should be killed alongside their parents, Himmler provided answers. He approached the logistics of genocide the way another man might approach running a factory. There were quotas to meet, resources to allocate, personnel issues to resolve. Under his leadership, the SS grew into a state within a state, with its own economic enterprises, its own military units, its own racial ideology, enforced with fanatical zeal. The deaths of millions of people were treated as administrative matters, documented with German thoroughness in reports that Himmler read and filed away. As Germany collapsed in early 1945, Himmler made desperate attempts to save himself. He had the delusional idea that he could negotiate with the Western Allies, that they might see him as a reasonable partner against the Soviets. He tried to open back-channel communications, offering to stop killing Jews in exchange for favorable treatment. These bizarre overtures went nowhere. Hitler, upon learning of Himmler's negotiations, stripped him of all rank and declared him a traitor. When the end came, Himmler shaved his mustache, put on an eye patch, and attempted to disappear into the chaos of defeated Germany using false papers. A dead Gestapo officer. He joined the masses of refugees and demobilized soldiers clogging the roads, just another anonymous face in a defeated nation. For 2 weeks he successfully evaded capture, moving from place to place, sleeping rough, trying to make his way to Bavaria where he apparently hoped to hide. On May 21, 1945, Himmler and 2 aides were stopped at a routine British checkpoint near Bremen. The soldiers were looking for fleeing SS members, and something about the 3 men aroused suspicion. They were taken into custody for interrogation. For 2 days Himmler maintained his false identity, but the British were not fooled. His papers were too good, his bearing too military, his evasions too practiced. On May 23, when a doctor was called to examine him more closely, Himmler suddenly bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. The poison acted quickly. Despite attempts to save him, one of the greatest mass murderers in history died within 15 minutes, choking and convulsing on the floor. He was 44 years old. The British buried his body in an unmarked grave, somewhere in the forests near Nuremberg. The exact location was kept secret and remains unknown to this day. Precisely to prevent the site from becoming any kind of shrine, Himmler escaped earthly justice by seconds. But he could not escape the judgment of history. His name became forever synonymous with the industrialization of murder, the transformation of genocide into bureaucratic routine. Reinhard Heydrich earned the nickname the Butcher of Prague, and even Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. As head of the Reich Security Main Office, Heydrich controlled the Gestapo and the SD, the intelligence service of the SS. He was Himmler's right hand, and perhaps even more dangerous because he combined ideological fanaticism with genuine intelligence and organizational ability. Heydrich was tall, blond, an accomplished violinist and fencer who embodied the Nazi ideal of Aryan masculinity. He was also utterly ruthless. In 1941, Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference, the meeting where Nazi leadership formally coordinated the implementation of the final solution, the plan to murder every Jew in Europe. The minutes from that conference, written in the sanitized language of bureaucracy, spoke of evacuation to the east and final solution of the Jewish question, euphemisms for mass murder. Heydrich ran that meeting with cold efficiency, laying out the logistics of continental-scale genocide over lunch. The 15 men in attendance represented various government ministries and Nazi organizations, and Heydrich ensured they all understood their roles in the killing process. Before Wannsee, Heydrich had already proven his capacity for mass murder. In September 1941, he was appointed Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, essentially the Nazi governor of occupied Czechoslovakia. The Czechs called this period the Heydrich Terror. He immediately instituted martial law and launched a campaign of executions targeting the Czech resistance and anyone suspected of opposition. In his first few months in Prague, over 400 people were executed, thousands more were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Heydrich combined terror with calculation. He also improved food rations for Czech workers and maintained armament production at high levels, showing that his brutality served strategic purpose. He wanted to pacify the Czechs enough to keep them productive for the German war effort, while eliminating any possibility of resistance. The terror worked. Czech resistance operations were severely disrupted, and Heydrich reported to Berlin that the situation was under control. The Czech government in exile in London saw Heydrich as a uniquely dangerous figure who had to be eliminated. In one of the most daring operations of World War II, Czech and Slovak agents trained by the British Special Operations Executive parachuted into Czechoslovakia with orders to assassinate Heydrich. On May 27, 1942, as Heydrich's car slowed at a turn in Prague, the agents attacked. One threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded near the vehicle. The blast did not immediately kill Heydrich, but it drove fragments of metal, wood, and upholstery into his body, along with horsehair from the car's seats. Heydrich drew his pistol and tried to chase his attackers before collapsing. He was rushed to a hospital where German doctors performed emergency surgery. For a week it seemed he might survive. Then infection set in. The horsehair and other debris in his wounds became breeding grounds for bacteria. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died of septicemia. He was 38 years old. The Nazi response to Heydrich's death was characteristically savage. Hitler ordered immediate reprisals. The villages of Lidice and Lizaki were completely destroyed. In Lidice, all men over 16 were shot, the women were sent to concentration camps, and the children were either sent to camps or, if they looked sufficiently Aryan, were given to German families. The village itself was burned and bulldozed, the ruins covered over so that nothing remained. Altogether, more than 1,300 people were killed in reprisals for Heydrich's assassination. The assassins themselves hid in a Prague church, but were eventually betrayed. German forces surrounded the church, and in the final battle, the Czech agents used their last bullets on themselves, rather than be captured alive. Heydrich was given a massive state funeral in Berlin, with Hitler himself delivering the eulogy. He was buried in the Invalidenfriedhof cemetery in Berlin, but his grave was destroyed in 1945. The location lost. Of all the major Nazi war criminals, Heydrich was the only one to be killed during the war itself, brought down not by Allied armies, but by a handful of brave men with a modified grenade and the determination to strike a blow against evil, whatever the cost. Adolf Eichmann held the bureaucratic title of lieutenant colonel in the SS, but his role in the Holocaust was absolutely central. As head of the Gestapo's Jewish Affairs section, Eichmann was responsible for the logistics of genocide. He organized the transportation of millions of Jews from across occupied Europe to the extermination camps. Every train schedule, every deportation order, every coordination with local authorities went through his office. Eichmann approached this work with the enthusiasm of a man who had found his calling. He learned Hebrew, studied Jewish culture, and visited Palestine before the war, all to better understand the people he would later help destroy. He was present at the Wannsee Conference, taking notes as Heydrich laid out the final solution. Then, he made it happen. When the Nazis occupied Hungary in 1944, Eichmann personally went to Budapest and in just a few months organized the deportation of over 400,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz, most of whom were immediately gassed upon arrival. This operation was conducted with such speed and efficiency that it shocked even some hardened Nazis. Eichmann was not a sadist in the conventional sense. He did not personally torture or kill people. His weapon was the railroad timetable, the deportation list, the carefully organized roundup. He murdered with paperwork and logistics. Witnesses described him as a colorless bureaucrat, polite and methodical. But this ordinariness masked absolute dedication to genocide. When subordinates reported difficulties, Eichmann found solutions. When Hungarian officials tried to slow down deportations, Eichmann threatened and cajoled and bribed until the trains ran on schedule. When the war was clearly lost and even Himmler was talking about stopping the killings, Eichmann kept organizing transports, kept sending people to their deaths, determined to fulfill what he saw as his mission to the very end. In the final days of the war, he reportedly said that he would jump into his grave laughing, because the death of 6 million Jews gave him extraordinary satisfaction. When Germany surrendered, Eichmann was captured by American forces but concealed his identity, claiming to be a low-ranking soldier named Otto Eckmann. In 1946, he escaped from a detention camp and went underground, living in Germany for several years while plotting his escape from Europe. In 1950, using false papers and assisted by a network of Nazi sympathizers and possibly corrupt Catholic officials along the so-called ratline escape routes. Eichmann made his way to Argentina. He lived in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement, working various jobs, eventually bringing his family to join him. For a decade, he lived quietly, one more German immigrant in a country that asked few questions about where its European arrivals came from, or what they might have done during the war. But Nazi hunters never stopped looking for Eichmann. Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, received tips about his location as early as 1957. It took years to confirm his identity and plan an operation. In 1960, a team of Mossad agents traveled to Argentina, located Eichmann, and snatched him off the street in a daring operation. They held him in a safe house while preparing to smuggle him out of the country. On May 20, 1960, Eichmann was drugged and dressed as an airline crew member, then flown to Israel on an El Al flight. The operation was completely illegal under international law, a brazen violation of Argentine sovereignty. Argentina protested, but Israel was unmoved. Some crimes, Israeli leaders argued, transcended normal legal procedures. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961 became one of the most important trials of the 20th century. It was the first trial televised internationally, and the testimony of Holocaust survivors was broadcast to the world. For weeks, witnesses described the horrors of the camps, the selections, the gas chambers, the mountains of corpses. Eichmann sat in a bulletproof glass booth, wearing headphones to hear the translation, his face showing little emotion. His defense was simple and would become infamous. He was just following orders. He was a transportation specialist who arranged trains. He was a small cog in a vast machine. He had no personal animus against Jews. The prosecution systematically destroyed these claims, showing that Eichmann had repeatedly gone beyond his orders, that he had shown initiative and enthusiasm in his work, that he had taken personal pride in the efficiency of his killing operations. The BAS judges were not persuaded by Eichmann's defense. On December 15, 1961, he was convicted on all counts, including crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes. The death sentence was a foregone conclusion. Eichmann appealed, but the appeal was rejected. On May 31, 1962, shortly before midnight, Adolf Eichmann was hanged at Ramla prison. He was offered a final glass of red wine, which he accepted, drinking half of it. He refused a hood. His last words were chilling in their final embrace of Nazi ideology. He said he had lived by his principles and did not believe in life after death, then added, "Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. These are the three countries with which I have been most closely associated, and I shall not forget them." 2 hours later, his body was cremated, and the ashes were scattered in the Mediterranean Sea beyond Israel's territorial waters, ensuring there would be no grave for neo-Nazi pilgrims to visit. He was 56 years old. The trial and execution of Adolf Eichmann showed that time and distance were no refuge for those who committed genocide, that justice might be delayed but need not be denied. Josef Mengele earned the title Angel of Death for his role as a physician at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Of all the Nazi criminals, Mengele perhaps inspired the most visceral horror because he perverted the medical profession, transforming healing into torture. Mengele stood on the selection ramp at Auschwitz, dressed impeccably in his SS uniform, sometimes whistling classical music while deciding with a casual gesture of his hand who would live and who would die. To the right meant temporary survival and forced labor. To the left meant the gas chambers, usually within hours. Mengele made these selections with the demeanor of someone sorting mail. He was particularly interested in twins, dwarfs, and anyone with unusual physical characteristics. These people were pulled from the selection lines and sent to Mengele's medical block, where they became subjects for experiments that had no scientific value and served only to satisfy Mengele's curiosity and cruelty. The experiments Mengele conducted were horrific beyond description. He injected chemicals into children's eyes, trying to change eye color. He performed surgeries without anesthesia. He deliberately infected prisoners with diseases to study their progression. He attempted to create conjoined twins by surgically connecting children together. He injected chloroform directly into twins' hearts to see if they would die simultaneously. Survivors described Mengele as charming and polite one moment, then casually shooting a child who displeased him the next. He kept detailed records of his experiments, photographs and measurements, and notes, all done with scientific precision in service of racial ideology, masquerading as research. When the twins or other subjects inevitably died from his experiments, he dissected them, preserving organs and body parts which he sent to research institutes in Berlin. The entire medical block became a chamber of horrors, where the oath to do no harm was inverted into systematic torture. Mengele's exact death toll is unknown, but he was directly responsible for the murders of at least thousands of people through his selections and experiments. He worked at Auschwitz from May 1943 until the camp was evacuated in January 1945 as Soviet forces approached. During that time, he distinguished himself as particularly zealous, even among the SS doctors. Other SS personnel remembered him as someone who seemed to enjoy his work, who volunteered for extra duty on the selection ramps, who treated the mass murder around him as an opportunity for advancement in research. When he learned that a shipment of Roma people was scheduled to be gassed, Mengele personally went through the camp's Roma section selecting subjects for his collection. He had his favorites among the twin children, giving them candy and toys, then killing them for dissection when their usefulness ended. When Auschwitz was evacuated, Mengele fled west. Unlike many Nazis who were captured in the immediate aftermath of the war, Mengele successfully went underground. He hid on a farm in Bavaria, using a false name. In 1949, perhaps through Vatican connections or sympathetic networks, he obtained false papers and a Red Cross travel document. In the name of Helmut Gregor, he sailed to Argentina, where he lived openly for a time, even practicing medicine under his real name. Argentina under Perón was welcoming to former Nazis, and Mengele felt secure enough to use his real identity. He became a partner in a pharmaceutical company and lived comfortably. But as Nazi hunters became more active and international pressure grew, Mengele became increasingly paranoid about capture. In 1959, arrest warrants were issued and West Germany requested his extradition from Argentina. Mengele fled to Paraguay, where he obtained citizenship in 1959, probably through bribery. Later he moved to Brazil, living in Sao Paulo, constantly moving, increasingly isolated and fearful. The Israeli operation that captured Eichmann in 1960 convinced Mengele that he could be next. He became a recluse, living with a couple who sheltered him in exchange for financial support. His health deteriorated. He suffered strokes, and his mental state declined. On February 7, 1979, while swimming at a beach resort in Brazil, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. He was 67 years old. He was buried under the false name Wolfgang Gerhard. For years, rumors persisted that Mengele was still alive. Sightings reported from across South America. In 1985, following new leads, authorities in Germany, Israel, and the United States cooperated to investigate. They raided addresses in Sao Paulo and found documents. They located the grave. The body was exhumed and examined by forensic experts. In 1992, DNA testing conclusively proved the body was Josef Mengele. The angel of death had died decades earlier, escaping justice, living out his years in fear and paranoia, but never facing trial for his crimes. Unlike Eichmann, Mengele never had to confront his victims in court, never had to hear the testimony of those he tortured, never had to answer for transforming medicine into murder. His escape remains one of the most frustrating failures of post-war justice, a reminder that some monsters died in their beds while their victims died in agony. Rudolf Höss served as the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz, overseeing the camp from 1940 to 1943, then briefly returning in 1944 during the mass murder of Hungarian Jews. Under Höss's administration, Auschwitz was transformed from a relatively small concentration camp into the largest and most efficient killing center in human history. Höss was a true believer in Nazi ideology, a man who approached genocide as a technical problem to be solved through German efficiency and organizational skill. He was present at Auschwitz when the first experiments with Zyklon B gas were conducted on Soviet prisoners of war. He recognized that gas chambers were more efficient than shooting and set about industrializing murder. Under his direction, the camp expanded dramatically. The Birkenau section was built specifically as an extermination facility with multiple gas chambers and crematoria capable of killing and disposing of thousands of people per day. Höss ran Auschwitz like a business, constantly seeking improvements in efficiency and capacity. When the crematoria could not keep up with the number of bodies, he ordered open-air burning pits. When questions arose about the most efficient way to pack people into gas chambers, Höss oversaw experiments to determine optimal density. When Zyklon B pellets proved slower than expected, adjustments were made to ventilation and temperature. All of this was documented in reports that Höss submitted to his superiors with evident pride in his accomplishments. He lived with his wife and children in a villa next to the camp, raising his family in a comfortable home within sight and smell of the crematoria chimneys. His wife tended a garden. His children played, and every day thousands of people were murdered on his orders, just meters away. In his autobiography, written while awaiting execution, Höss estimated that at least 2.5 million people were gassed at Auschwitz during his tenure, with another 500,000 dying from disease and starvation. What made Höss particularly chilling was his complete lack of remorse, combined with an almost bureaucratic approach to explaining his actions. He did not hate Jews, he claimed. He was simply following orders to implement the final solution, and he approached those orders with the same dedication he would bring to any assignment. He described the technical challenges of mass murder, the logistical difficulties of disposing of so many bodies, the economic questions of how to efficiently extract valuables from victims, all in the flat tone of a manager discussing production targets. In his mind, he was a dedicated soldier and administrator doing his duty, nothing more. The fact that his duty consisted of organizing murder on an unimaginable scale seemed not to penetrate his consciousness. He expressed concern that the work was hard on his men, that the constant killing took a psychological toll on the guards and Sonderkommando prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers. He did not express similar concern for the victims. When Auschwitz was evacuated in January 1945, Höss destroyed as much documentation as possible and fled. He obtained false papers identifying him as Franz Lang, a sailor, and found work as a farmhand in northern Germany. He lived quietly for nearly a year after the war ended, avoiding capture while many other Nazis were being rounded up. But British intelligence received information about his whereabouts from his wife, whom they had arrested and interrogated. On March 11, 1946, British military police captured Höss on a farm near Flensburg. According to some accounts, he was beaten during initial interrogation, though he quickly began to cooperate fully, seemingly eager to explain his role in the Holocaust. Höss became a key prosecution witness at the Nuremberg trials, testifying in April 1946. His testimony was devastating to the defense efforts of other defendants. He calmly confirmed the existence and operation of the gas chambers, the scale of the murders, the systematic nature of the extermination program. His matter-of-fact descriptions left the courtroom in shocked silence. Here was a man explaining mass murder with the same tone someone might use to describe running a factory. After testifying at Nuremberg, Höss was handed over to Polish authorities, as Auschwitz was in Poland and Polish courts had jurisdiction over crimes committed there. He was put on trial in Warsaw in March 1947. The trial lasted a month. The evidence was overwhelming and Höss did not seriously contest the facts. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was hanged at Auschwitz, next to the villa where he had lived with his family, in sight of the crematoria where so many had died. The execution took place at the camp itself. a deliberate decision to have justice rendered at the scene of the crimes. Höss walked to the gallows calmly, showing no emotion. He was 45 years old. Before his execution, he had written an autobiography at the request of Polish investigators, a document that remains one of the most important and disturbing primary sources about the Holocaust. In it, Höss described his life, his career, his work at Auschwitz, all with the same disturbing lack of moral awareness. He complained that he had been made a scapegoat, that he was only following orders, that others were equally responsible. Even facing death, he could not, or would not, acknowledge the moral enormity of what he had done. His execution brought some measure of justice, but the man himself remained an enigma to the end, a seemingly ordinary person who had committed extraordinary evil and never truly grasped why that was wrong. Klaus Barbie earned the nickname the Butcher of Lyon during his time as head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France. From 1942 to 1944, Barbie was responsible for the torture and murder of thousands of French civilians, resistance fighters, and Jews. He personally tortured prisoners, taking evident pleasure in inflicting pain. Survivors described sessions where Barbie beat them with metal rods, burned them, nearly drowned them, all while screaming questions and insults. He was particularly brutal toward women and children, showing no mercy to anyone. One of his most notorious crimes was the roundup of Jewish children from the village of Iziu. On April 6, 1944, Barbie personally led a raid on a children's home where 44 Jewish children and 7 adults were sheltering. All were deported to Auschwitz, where the children were immediately gassed. Barbie also ordered the last deportation train from Lyon on August 11, 1944, just days before the city was liberated, sending over 600 people to their deaths in a final act of spite and cruelty. Barbie was also responsible for the capture and torture of Jean Moulin, one of the most important leaders of the French resistance. Moulin died from the torture Barbie inflicted, becoming a martyr for the resistance and a French national hero. The brutality of Moulin's treatment shocked even some hardened German officers. Barbie tortured Moulin for days, but Moulin never revealed information about other resistance members. He died either from the torture or from a suicide attempt while being transported to Germany. Barbie showed no remorse and reportedly bragged about the interrogation afterward. His time in Lyon was marked by constant terror. People lived in fear of the black cars pulling up, of the midnight knock on the door, of being taken to the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Berthelot, where screams echoed through the building day and night. When Lyon was liberated in September 1944, Barbie fled to Germany. As the Third Reich collapsed, he went underground. But unlike many Nazis who tried to disappear into civilian life, Barbie found a different kind of refuge. American intelligence, specifically the Counterintelligence Corps, recruited him in 1947 to work against the Soviets and Communists in post-war Germany. The Americans knew who Barbie was, knew about his crimes, but they valued his intelligence contacts and his knowledge of communist networks. For nearly 4 years, Barbie worked for American intelligence while French authorities sought him for war crimes. The Americans protected him, lied to the French about his whereabouts, and eventually helped him escape to South America when his position became untenable. In 1951, using false papers and with covert American assistance, Barbie traveled to Bolivia along with his wife and children, living under the name Klaus Altmann. In Bolivia, Barbie reinvented himself as a successful businessman and advisor to various regimes. He became a consultant to multiple Bolivian governments, particularly on security matters and counterinsurgency. When the Bolivian military wanted to crack down on leftist opposition, they turned to Barbie for advice, and he apparently helped train interrogators and security forces, passing on the torture techniques he had perfected in Lyon. He became wealthy, lived openly in La Paz, sent his children to good schools, and socialized with the Bolivian elite. He maintained contact with other Nazi fugitives in South America, and reportedly helped some of them establish themselves in Bolivia. For decades, Nazi hunters and French prosecutors sought Barbie. His cover as Klaus Altmann was blown in 1971 but Bolivia refused extradition requests. The Bolivian government, which at the time was controlled by military dictators who valued Barbie's expertise, simply ignored international pressure. Not until 1983, after Bolivia transitioned to democratic rule, did the situation change. The new government agreed to expel Barbie, and on February 5, 1983, he was put on a plane to French custody. After nearly 40 years on the run, the butcher of Lyon would finally face justice. His trial in Lyon in 1987 was a major international event. Barbie, now 73 years old, showed the same arrogance he had displayed during the war. He called the proceedings a masquerade and showed no remorse. Survivors testified about the torture, about watching their families destroyed, about the screams from the interrogation rooms. On July 4, 1987, Klaus Barbie was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict was met with relief by survivors and by France as a nation. Barbie was sent to St. Paul prison in Lyon, where he remained until his death. He died of leukemia on September 25, 1991, at the age of 77. He served only 4 years of his life sentence, but at least he spent his final years behind bars, rather than living comfortably in Bolivia. The Barbie case highlighted uncomfortable truths about the Cold War, about how Western intelligence services recruited and protected Nazi war criminals when it served their purposes, about how the pursuit of justice could be delayed or diverted by geopolitical considerations, that Barbie lived freely for nearly 4 decades, that he prospered and raised a family while his victims lay in mass graves, remained a source of anger and frustration for survivors and for anyone who cared about accountability. Alois Brunner was one of Adolf Eichmann's most efficient deputies and one of the most committed implementers of the final solution. He organized deportations of Jews from Austria, Greece, France, and Slovakia, personally overseeing the transport of over 128,000 Jews to concentration camps where most were murdered. Brunner was not a desk-bound bureaucrat. He went to the ghettos and camps, personally supervised roundups, and showed enthusiasm for his work that impressed even his superiors. In Vienna, he established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which was actually a mechanism for robbing Jews of their property and organizing their deportation. In Greece, he oversaw the deportation of nearly the entire Jewish community of Salonika, over 45,000 people, to Auschwitz in 1943. In France, he ran the Drancy internment camp, the main transit point for French Jews being sent to death camps. At Drancy, Brunner instituted a regime of terror, beating prisoners himself, starving them, and organizing deportations with ruthless efficiency. What distinguished Brunner even among Nazi criminals was his complete lack of any later denial or equivocation about his actions. After the war, in the few interviews he gave from hiding, Brunner expressed pride in his work. He stated that his only regret was not killing more Jews, that he was proud of his role in the Holocaust, that he would do it all again. This unrepentant stance made him particularly sought after by Nazi hunters. When Germany fell, Brunner initially worked for American intelligence, like Barbie, but his cover was blown, and he became a fugitive. He lived briefly in Rome, then made his way to Egypt in the early 1950s, finding refuge in the Middle East where hostility to Israel made some Arab governments willing to shelter wanted Nazis. Brunner lived in Damascus, Syria from 1954 until his death, working as an advisor to the Syrian government on security and interrogation methods. Syria repeatedly refused extradition requests from Germany, Austria, and France. Brunner lived under the transparent alias George Fisher, but everyone knew who he was. The Syrians protected him, seeing him as useful and apparently unconcerned about his past. In the 1960s and 1980s, letter bombs were sent to Brunner, widely believed to be from Israeli intelligence. The first bomb in 1961 cost him an eye. The second, in 1980, cost him fingers on his left hand. These attacks did not kill him, but they drove him deeper into hiding. He lived in a Damascus apartment under Syrian guard, venturing out rarely, increasingly paranoid about assassination attempts. The exact date of Brunner's death remains unclear, shrouded in Syrian secrecy. Syria never officially acknowledged his presence and provided no information about his fate. Various reports suggested he died in 2001 or 2010. In 2014, a report by German intelligence concluded he had died in Damascus in 2010 at the age of 98. The Syrian government never confirmed or denied this. No body was produced, no grave identified. Brunner apparently died of old age in his bed, having escaped justice entirely, never facing trial despite decades of international arrest warrants. His case represents perhaps the most complete failure of post-war justice. He was unrepentant, widely known to be alive, and repeatedly convicted in absentia, yet protected by a government that valued him more than it cared about international law or common decency. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, the leading Nazi hunting organization, listed Brunner as one of the most wanted Nazi criminals for decades. In 2001, France convicted him in absentia and sentenced him to life in prison. But these were hollow gestures. Brunner lived comfortably in Damascus, protected and unafraid. In the few interviews he gave, conducted through a door to reporters allowed briefly near his apartment, he reiterated his lack of remorse. He said the Jews deserved what happened to them, that he wished he had killed more, that the Holocaust did not go far enough. These statements, coming from a man in his 80s and 90s, demonstrated that he remained until the end what he had always been, a true believer in Nazi ideology, who never wavered, never questioned, never felt the slightest guilt. That such a man died peacefully, rather than on the gallows, remains a wound in the historical record. A reminder that justice delayed can indeed be justice denied. Herbert Heim, known as Dr. Heim, known as Death, was an SS doctor who worked at the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria for just 6 weeks in 1941. But in that short time he committed atrocities so horrific that he became one of the most wanted Nazi war criminals. Heim performed experimental surgeries on prisoners without anesthesia, often for no medical purpose whatsoever. He removed organs from living patients to see how long they would survive. He injected poison directly into prisoners' hearts, while timing how long it took them to die. Survivors testified that Heim would whistle as he cut prisoners open, that he seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain. One survivor described watching Heim operate on a healthy young man, removing his stomach, liver, and other organs piece by piece while the victim was fully conscious, simply because Heim wanted practice in organ removal. The young man died in agony on the operating table. Heim's time at Mauthausen was relatively brief, because he was transferred to other duties, but in those 6 weeks he earned his grim nickname. After leaving Mauthausen, he served as an SS doctor at other locations, though his activities there are less well documented. When the war ended, Heim returned to Baden-Baden, and initially lived openly under his own name, working as a gynecologist. He married, had 2 children, and built a seemingly normal post-war life. German authorities investigated him in the 1960s after survivors identified him and described his crimes, but the investigation moved slowly. In 1962, before he could be arrested, someone tipped off Heim that he was about to be charged. He fled, leaving his family behind, and disappeared. For decades, Heim was thought to be living in South America. Like so many other Nazi fugitives, the Wiesenthal Center listed him as one of the most wanted Nazi criminals. There were reported sightings from Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Spain. Authorities investigated tips, but Heim remained elusive. In reality, Heim had gone to Egypt, living in Cairo under the name Tariq Hussein Farid. He converted to Islam, taking a Muslim name, and lived modestly, working odd jobs teaching languages and blending into Cairo's expatriate community. He apparently maintained contact with his family through intermediaries who sent him money. He lived quietly, told people he was from Austrian, and had come to Egypt for political reasons, and never revealed his true identity to those around him. Heim died in Cairo in 1992 of intestinal cancer at the age of 78, having lived free for 30 years after fleeing Germany. His death remained unknown to Nazi hunters until 2009, when a joint investigation by German and Austrian authorities, working with the Wiesenthal Center, finally traced his path to Egypt. They found his death certificate, his grave, his converted name, the whole story of his hidden life. The discovery was simultaneously a relief, confirming he was no longer alive, and a frustration, revealing that yet another major war criminal had died peacefully rather than facing justice. Haim's landlord in Cairo, interviewed after the truth emerged, remembered him as a quiet, polite tenant who paid his rent on time and kept to himself. This ordinariness, this ability of monsters to pass as normal people, recurred again and again in the stories of Nazi fugitives. The Heim case highlighted the limitations of post-war justice efforts. Despite being sought for decades, despite international cooperation and significant resources devoted to the hunt, he successfully disappeared into Cairo's anonymity and lived out his natural lifespan. His family reportedly received briefcases of cash from him, money he apparently earned or saved, suggesting his life in exile was not particularly impoverished. Some of his victims were still alive when investigators finally confirmed his death. Megators finally confirmed his death, but they would never see him in court, never hear him answer for his crimes, never get even the cold comfort of watching him convicted. Haim was buried in Cairo, his grave marked with his assumed Muslim name, the final layer of deception in a life spent evading accountability. Otto Skorzeny was a different kind of Nazi criminal, known more for his military operations than for atrocities, but his post-war activities and his role in commando raids that violated the laws of war earned him a place in the catalogue of wanted men. Skorzeny was Hitler's favorite commando, famous for the daring 1943 raid that rescued Benito Mussolini from Italian captors, tall and scarred from a fencing duel. Skorzeny looked like Central Casting's idea of a Nazi warrior. He led special operations throughout the war, including Operation Grief during the Battle of the Bulge, where German soldiers dressed in American uniforms and using captured American vehicles infiltrated behind Allied lines to create confusion. This operation was a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions, as fighting in enemy uniforms is considered perfidy, and those captured can be executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. After the war, Skorzeny was held in American custody and tried by a military tribunal for the Operation Grief violations. The trial was complicated. Skorzeny argued that his men had orders to change back into German uniforms before engaging in combat, making their actions legal under the laws of war. The prosecution argued that simply infiltrating in false uniforms was itself a violation. In September 1947, Skorzeny was acquitted, partially because a British officer testified that Allied forces had used similar tactics. However, Skorzeny remained in detention because he was wanted for other potential crimes and denazification proceedings. In 1948, he escaped from a detention camp with apparent help from former SS colleagues and went on the run. Skorzeny fled to France, then to Spain, where he found refuge under Franco's regime. Spain in the 1950s was a haven for former Nazis, and Skorzeny lived openly in Madrid, even running a construction business. But his post-war activities went far beyond building projects. Skorzeny allegedly became involved in what some called the Odessa Network, though historians debate whether Odessa as a formal organization existed or whether it was more a loose network of sympathizers helping Nazis escape. What is documented is that Skorzeny helped other wanted Nazis flee to South America and the Middle East. He reportedly worked for Israeli intelligence in the 1960s, feeding them information about German scientists working in Egypt on weapons programs. This bizarre arrangement of former SS officer working for Israel was supposedly motivated by Skorzeny's pragmatism and need for income, rather than any ideological change. Skorzeny also worked as a military consultant for various regimes advising on counterinsurgency and security matters. He maintained contact with networks of former SS members and was involved in various business schemes with other Nazi veterans. He lived comfortably in Madrid, wrote his memoirs, gave interviews, and became something of a celebrity among those who romanticized the Wehrmacht and SS. He portrayed himself as a loyal soldier who had followed orders, a patriot rather than a criminal. He denied knowledge of the Holocaust and claimed he fought only for Germany, not for Nazi ideology, a common refrain among ex-Nazis seeking rehabilitation. Skorzeny died of lung cancer in Madrid on July 5, 1975, at the age of 67. He was never prosecuted for any crimes beyond the Operation Greif trial. His funeral was attended by former SS comrades, who gave Nazi salutes at the graveside, a final demonstration of their unrepentant allegiance. Skorzeny's case illustrates how the nature of one's crimes and one's usefulness to Cold War intelligence services could determine post-war fate. He was protected by Spain, apparently used by Israel, and lived openly while others hunted in vain for Mengele and Brunner. He became a minor celebrity, his wartime exploits the subject of books and films that often glossed over the darker aspects of his service. That he died peacefully in his bed surrounded by admirers struck many as unjust, another instance of a Nazi criminal avoiding accountability. Franz Stangl commanded the Treblinka extermination camp from March 1943, the period of its peak killing capacity. Under Stangl's administration, an estimated 900,000 people were murdered at Treblinka, making it the second deadliest Nazi extermination camp after Auschwitz. Stangl ran Treblinka with an emphasis on deception and efficiency. Victims arriving by train were led to believe they had arrived at a transit camp, that they were going to shower and be deloused before continuing their journey. The elaborate deception, which Stangl cursively refined, kept victims calm and made them easier to manage. Fake train station signs were erected, including a fake ticket window and a fake clock. Prisoners selected to work as Sonderkommando told new arrivals they were indeed just passing through. Only when victims were herded into the gas chambers did the truth become undeniable, and by then, it was too late. Stangl was unique among camp commandants in that he later gave extensive interviews to journalist Gitter Sereny, interviews that were published in the book Into That Darkness. In these conversations, Stangl presented himself as a man who had been trapped by circumstances. Stangl presented himself as a man who had been trapped by circumstances, who had not wanted to run an extermination camp, but had been ordered to do so, and saw no way out. He described his psychological coping mechanisms, how he emotionally distanced himself from what was happening, how he focused on administrative tasks, and convinced himself he was just a bureaucrat. He claimed he never personally killed anyone, that he stayed in his office and let subordinates handle the actual murders. Survivors contradicted this, describing Stangl walking through the camp in his white uniform, perfectly dressed, watching the selections, present, and aware of every aspect of the killing process. When the Red Army approached in 1943, Treblinka was dismantled, the gas chambers demolished, the mass graves exhumed, and the bodies burned to destroy evidence. Stangl was transferred to Italy to fight partisans, a reward for his efficient service. When Germany surrendered, he was captured by American forces but escaped from custody in 1947, fleeing to Syria where he worked in a textile mill. In 1951, with help from a Catholic bishop who provided false papers, Stangl emigrated to Brazil. He lived in Sao Paulo, working for Volkswagen, living under his own name, even registering with the Austrian consulate as required for expatriates. He made no serious effort to hide his identity, apparently confident that he was safe in Brazil. In 1967, after years of investigation, Simon Wiesenthal discovered Stangl's location and informed German and Brazilian authorities. On February 28, 1967, Brazilian police arrested Stangl at his home. He was extradited to West Germany and put on trial in Dusseldorf. The trial lasted nearly 2 years. Stangl continued to claim he was just following orders, that he had no choice, that he personally did not kill anyone. The court rejected these defenses. On December 22, 1970, Stangl is convicted of co-responsibility for the murder of 900,000 people at Treblinka and sentenced to life in prison. It was one of the longest sentences imposed on any Nazi war criminal. Stangl served only 6 months of his sentence. On June 28, 1971, he died of heart failure in Dusseldorf prison, at the age of 63. His death came shortly after his final interviews with Gitta Sereny, conversations in which he seemed, for the first time, to acknowledge the full weight of what he had done. In their last meeting, Stangl reportedly said, "My guilt is that I am still here," an ambiguous statement that might have indicated genuine remorse or simply acceptance of his situation. Sereny believed she saw a change in Stangl at the end, a cracking of the psychological defenses he had maintained for decades. Whether that represented genuine moral reckoning, or simply the exhaustion of an old man facing death, remains unclear. What is certain is that Stangl, unlike Mengele and Brunner, did face trial, did hear survivors testify, did receive the guilty verdict he deserved, even if his punishment was cut short by natural death. Ernst Kaltenbrunner succeeded Reinhard Heydrich as head of the Reich Security Main Office, making him responsible for the Gestapo, the SD, and the entire security apparatus of the SS from 1943 until the war's end. Kaltenbrunner was a massive man, over 6 feet tall, with a scarred face from a youthful accident that gave him a perpetually intimidating appearance. He oversaw the continued implementation of the final solution during the war's final years, approved the execution of resistance fighters, and signed orders for the murder of prisoners of war. He was directly involved in ordering reprisals and executions, personally signing death warrants for thousands of people. As the war turned against Germany, Kaltenbrunner intensified rather than moderated the terror, determined that if Germany was to fall, it would take as many of its enemies as possible with it. Kaltenbrunner was also involved in the last-minute murder of prisoners in concentration camps as Allied forces approached. Orders went out to evacuate or liquidate camps, rather than allow prisoners to be liberated, resulting in death marches and final massacres. Kaltenbrunner's signature appeared on many of these orders. He maintained to subordinates that Hitler's orders must be followed to the end, even as the Reich crumbled around them. His fanaticism never wavered. Even in April 1945, with Soviet forces in Berlin and American forces across the Rhine, Kaltenbrunner continued to sign execution orders and plan operations against partisans and resistance fighters. When Germany surrendered, Kaltenbrunner fled to the Austrian Alps, apparently hoping to hide in the mountains until he could arrange escape to South America. He was captured on May 12, 1945, by American troops acting on a tip. He was found hiding in a cabin, using a false name, carrying fake documents. Unlike some Nazis who went quietly, Kaltenbrunner initially tried to deny his identity, claiming to be a doctor. His massive size and distinctive facial scars made this claim ludicrous, and he was quickly identified. He was transported to Nuremberg to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal, along with other major Nazi leaders. At Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner presented a defense that would become standard among Nazi defendants. He claimed he was only a figurehead, that real authority had rested with others, that he knew nothing about the Holocaust, that his office was responsible only for counter-espionage, not for atrocities. He denied having seen concentration camps, denied knowledge of extermination programs, denied signing execution orders that prosecutors produced with his signature. His lies were methodically demolished. Documents were presented showing his direct involvement in massacres and murders. Survivors and subordinates testified about his orders and his knowledge. The evidence was overwhelming, and Kaltenbrunner's defense collapsed into increasingly desperate denials and evasions. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal found Kaltenbrunner guilty on counts of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out on October 16, 1946, in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. Of the 12 defendants sentenced to death at Nuremberg, 11 were hanged that night. The 12th, Hermann Göring, committed suicide hours before his scheduled execution. Kaltenbrunner went to the gallows at 1:36 a.m., Witnesses described him as defiant to the end, walking steadily to the scaffold, showing no emotion. The execution was deliberately inefficient, as the American hangman used ropes calculated to cause slow strangulation rather than a quick death by broken neck. Kaltenbrunner took over 24 minutes to die, jerking and convulsing on the rope in a prolonged death that witnesses found disturbing, even given his crimes. He was 43 years old. His body was cremated, and the ashes scattered in a river, like all the executed Nuremberg defendants, ensuring no grave could become a shrine. These 10 men represent different aspects of the Nazi killing machine. Some were true believers like Himmler and Heinrich, ideologues who embraced Nazi racial theories and threw themselves into implementing genocide with fanatical dedication. Others like Eichmann and Höss were bureaucrats who approached mass murder as a job to be done efficiently, who convinced themselves they were merely following orders and that responsibility lay elsewhere. Still others like Mengele and Heim were sadists who exploited the permissive environment of the camps to indulge their cruelties under the guise of science or duty. Men like Barbie and Brunner combined ideological commitment with personal brutality, taking evident pleasure in torture while also believing in the cause they served. Stangl tried to distance himself psychologically from his actions, building mental walls between his home life and his work. Kaltenbrunner represented the fanatic who never wavered, who continued ordering murders until the very end, convinced of the righteousness of his cause. Their fates, after the war, varied enormously, illustrating the uneven nature of post-war justice. Some like Heinrich died during the war, killed by resistance fighters before facing any reckoning. Some like Himmler and Göring took their own lives rather than face trial. Some like Kaltenbrunner and Höss were quickly captured, tried, and executed. Some like Eichmann and Stangl escaped, but were eventually found, tried decades later, and imprisoned. And some like Mengele, Brunner, Heim, Barbie, and Skorzeny successfully fled to countries that sheltered them, living out years or decades in freedom. Some dying peacefully in their beds, never facing a courtroom, never hearing survivors testify, never receiving the punishment their crimes deserved. The pursuit of Nazi war criminals became one of the great moral imperatives of the post-war era. Organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center, governments through agencies like Israel's Mossad, and dedicated individuals like the Klarsfelds spent decades tracking down fugitive Nazis. They faced enormous obstacles. Many South American countries were uncooperative, either because they sympathized with fascism or because they valued the technical expertise former Nazis could provide. The Cold War complicated everything, as both American and Soviet intelligence recruited Nazis whose knowledge of each other's systems was considered valuable. Documents were destroyed, identities changed, witnesses died, and time eroded the possibility of justice. As decades passed, the urgency faded for some, though never for survivors and their families. The trials that did occur served multiple purposes beyond punishment. They documented the Holocaust in legal proceedings, creating an official record that could not be denied. They gave survivors a chance to tell their stories in public, to confront their tormentors, to see some measure of justice, even if it came decades late. The trials educated new generations about what had happened, ensuring the Holocaust remained in public consciousness. They established important legal precedents about crimes against humanity, about the principle that following orders is not a defense for genocide, about the international community's obligation to punish those who commit mass atrocities. But the failures of post-war justice also cast long shadows. That Mengele died free, that Brunner lived comfortably in Damascus, that Barbie spent decades advising dictatorships, that Heim and others successfully vanished. These failures haunt the historical record. They raise difficult questions about the limitations of justice, about the protection powerful governments extended to useful war criminals, about whether the pursuit of Nazi fugitives should have been more aggressive. Some argue that too many resources were devoted to hunting aging Nazis, when those resources could have been used to prevent new atrocities. Others maintain that justice for historical crimes is essential to prevent future ones, that letting mass murderers escape sends a message that such crimes can be committed with impunity. The Nazi officers profiled here were not the only ones, not even close. Thousands of SS members, camp guards, Gestapo agents, Einsatzgruppen killers and other perpetrators were involved in the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. Most were never held accountable. Some were captured and tried in the years immediately after the war, during the wave of trials in Nuremberg and various countries, but many escaped or were released after short sentences during the 1950s, when Cold War concerns eclipsed the pursuit of Nazi criminals. Some returned to comfortable lives in Germany or Austria, their pasts quietly overlooked as societies sought to move forward. The economic miracle of 1950s West Germany was built in part by men who had served the Nazi regime, and an uneasy silence often surrounded inquiries into wartime activities. The question of how ordinary people become willing participants in genocide troubled philosophers and historians for decades after the war. The trial of Adolf Eichmann prompted political philosopher Hannah Arendt to write about the banality of evil. Her controversial observation that Eichmann was not a monster but rather a thoughtless bureaucrat who never fully grasped the moral enormity of his actions. This interpretation angered many who saw it as minimizing Eichmann's guilt, but Arendt was pointing to something important. Many Nazi criminals were indeed banal, ordinary people who committed extraordinary evil, and understanding how that happens is crucial to preventing it from happening again. The Nazi criminals discussed here operated within a system that legitimized and encouraged their actions. They were promoted for efficiency in murder, rewarded for dedication to genocide, praised by their superiors for their work. The Nazi state had inverted normal morality, creating an environment where mass murder was official policy, and those who questioned it were suspect. Some perpetrators were true believers who needed no encouragement. Others were careerists who saw opportunity for advancement. Still others were simply weak individuals who went along because resisting was difficult and dangerous. But whatever their motivations, they made choices. They could have refused assignments, accepted transfers, found ways to mitigate harm, or simply not volunteered for extra duty on the selection ramps. That most did not make these choices, that so many participated actively and even enthusiastically, remains the darkest lesson of the Holocaust. The hunt for Nazi war criminals continued into the 21st century, long after most perpetrators had died of old age. Germany, to its credit, never imposed a statute of limitations on murder, meaning Nazi criminals could be prosecuted no matter how much time had passed. In the 2000s and 2010s, German prosecutors brought cases against men in their 90s who had served as guards at concentration camps, arguing that by serving in the camps they were accessories to murder, even if they personally never killed anyone. These trials were controversial. Critics argued that prosecuting elderly men decades after their crimes served no purpose, that they posed no danger to society, that they were scapegoats for a system that had implicated thousands. Defenders argued that justice has no expiration date, that survivors deserved to see perpetrators punished no matter how old they were, that the principle of accountability must be maintained. The stories of these 10 Nazi officers and what happened to them after World War II illustrate fundamental truths about justice, evil, and human nature. They show that ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when placed in systems that legitimize and reward such behavior. They demonstrate that some individuals fully embrace evil while others participate reluctantly, but still participate. They reveal the limitations of international justice, how geopolitics and self-interest can obstruct accountability, how time and distance can provide sanctuary to those willing to abandon their old lives. They prove that some individuals never feel remorse, that Nazi ideology could produce true believers who went to their graves, convinced they had done right. And they show that while justice can be delayed and denied, the historical record remains, preserving the names and deeds of those who chose to serve the machinery of genocide. The Holocaust stands as the paradigmatic example of industrial-scale genocide, of what can happen when modern state power is harnessed to eliminationist ideology. The Nazi officers who implemented the final solution were educated products of Western civilization who chose to become mass murderers. Some faced punishment, some escaped it, but none could escape the judgment of history. Their names are forever associated with humanity's darkest chapter, and their actions serve as a permanent warning about the fragility of civilization and the ease with which it can collapse into barbarism. The fact that some died peacefully while others hanged, that justice was so uneven and incomplete, only underscores that preventing such crimes in the first place matters infinitely more than punishing them afterward. The pursuit of Nazi war criminals after 1945 was necessary and important, but it could never truly balance the scales after the murder of millions. The real lesson is that such crimes must never be allowed to begin, that ordinary people must resist when governments turn toward genocide, that following orders is never an excuse for participating in mass murder. These 10 men, and what happened to them after the war, remind us that choices matter, that individuals bear responsibility for their actions, and that history remembers both the criminals and those who brought them to justice.